step into the chrome void, a place where the boundaries of space and time begin to blur into a single reflection. Our cinematic journey explores the mysteries of existence and the meaning of our digital footprint. Hit subscribe now and explore the infinite reach of the human mind. 80 audit results came back. My manager didn't call me. He called the person above him, and that person called the person above her. By the time anyone thought to loop me in, there were already 3 lawyers in the conference room and a stack of documents with my name on every other page. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I have what my mother used to call a librarian voice. Soft, measured, the kind that makes people lean in rather than sit back. Growing up, I thought it was a compliment. In a corporate office in suburban Ohio, it turns out it reads as uncertainty. As someone who doesn't quite believe what she's saying, as someone you can talk over, I learned that early at Meridian Consulting Group, not in a dramatic moment, not in a single meeting where someone slammed a hand on a table and told me to speak up. It happened the way most things happen, gradually, then all at once. A colleague finishing my sentence in a client presentation, my name dropping off an email thread after I'd done the research, a performance review that said I showed excellent analytical skills but needed to develop executive presence. Executive presence. I've thought about that phrase a lot since then. What it meant in practice was that I needed to sound more like my manager, loud, confident whether he had the data or not. The kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately recalibrate everyone else's posture. My manager had been at Meridian for 11 years when I joined. He had a corner office he hadn't technically earned. It came with a reorganization that nobody explained, and a habit of repeating things other people said slightly louder and slightly later, so that by the time the meeting ended, everyone remembered it as his idea. I noticed this within my first 3 months. I told myself it didn't matter as long as the work was good. That was my first mistake. I joined Meridian as a mid-level financial analyst. My background was in risk assessment, specifically identifying exposure in long-term infrastructure contracts. It's not glamorous work. It involves a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of reading through contractor language that was written specifically to be misread, and a long, quiet attention span that I apparently inherited from my father, who could read the same contract paragraph 4 times until he understood what it was actually trying to say. Meridian had a government division that consulted for mid-sized municipalities, cities and counties trying to figure out whether their public infrastructure contracts were structured in ways that protected them. Bridges, water systems, transit. The clients weren't flashy, but the contracts were large and the exposure if something went wrong was enormous. I was assigned to 3 accounts in my first year. By my 3rd year, I was managing 7. None of that was reflected in my title, which was still Analyst 2, or in my salary, which had received 1 standard of living adjustment and nothing else. I raised this with my manager once. He told me the firm was going through a compensation review cycle and that he was advocating for me. He said it the way people say things they have no intention of following through on, pleasantly, with eye contact, leaning back slightly in his chair. I nodded and went back to my desk. Second mistake. Here's what I was doing while I wasn't advocating for myself. One of my accounts was a mid-sized county in western Pennsylvania, about 280,000 residents, aging water infrastructure, and a contractor relationship that had been in place for 9 years with almost no renegotiation. I started reviewing the original contract documents as part of a routine assessment, and what I found was not routine. The county was paying a 14% administrative overhead rate that had been grandfathered in from an earlier agreement. Industry standard at that point was closer to 8%. Over 9 years, the gap had compounded. When I ran the numbers, carefully, twice, then a 3rd time because I didn't trust myself, the county had overpaid by somewhere between $3.8 million and $4.2 million, depending on how you calculated certain line items. I documented everything. I built a model. I wrote a 12-page memo with an executive summary at the top because I knew my manager would only read the first 2 pages. I sent it to him on a Thursday afternoon. He forwarded it to the division VP with his name in the subject line. I found out on Monday when a colleague mentioned that my manager had apparently surfaced a major findings issue with the Pennsylvania account and was being asked to present to the partners. I sat at my desk for a long time after she told me that. The spreadsheet was still open on my screen. My name was in cell A1, where I always put it. I want to tell you I did something decisive right then, that I marched into my manager's office or replied all to the email thread or called the VP directly. I didn't. I closed the spreadsheet. I got a cup of coffee from the kitchen down the hall. I stood at the window for a minute looking at the parking lot, which was gray and half empty because it was still early, and I thought about what my father used to say when something unfair happened. You don't win by making noise, you win by being right when it counts. I wasn't sure yet when it would count, so I went back to my desk and I kept working. What I did do, and this part matters, was start keeping records, not in a dramatic building a case way, more like the way you start taking photos of a leak in your ceiling, not because you think you'll need evidence right now, but because you've started to understand the nature of what you're dealing with. Every memo I sent, I kept a copy with the timestamp in a personal folder on my home laptop. Every email thread where my contributions disappeared by the time it reached senior leadership, I noted the date and the original content. Every client conversation I initiated, I followed up with a brief written summary, ostensibly to confirm next steps, actually to create a paper trail. It took about 15 minutes a week, most weeks less. I wasn't building a case. I was just paying attention in a way I'd been trained not to. The Pennsylvania situation got my manager a lot of visibility that year. He was invited to present at a regional conference. He was mentioned in an internal newsletter. At the annual review, he received a performance bonus. I received my second standard of living adjustment. I scheduled a meeting with him to discuss it. He told me, and I am not paraphrasing, that the timing wasn't right and that I should think about whether I was positioning myself strategically. I asked him what that meant. He said I needed to be more visible. I thought about the 12-page memo sitting in his outbox with his name on it, and I smiled in a way that felt very far from my actual face. I'll keep that in mind, I said. This went on for another 14 months. I know that sounds long. It felt long. I want to be honest about that. There were weeks where I questioned everything. My read of the situation, my patience, whether keeping records was just a way of avoiding a harder conversation, whether my father's advice had been wisdom or just a quiet person's way of rationalizing inaction. I thought about leaving. I looked at job postings on Sunday evenings and felt a particular mix of hope and exhaustion that I think a lot of people in wrong-fit jobs will recognize. I applied to 2 positions and got to final interviews for both, and then, for reasons I still don't entirely understand, pulled back. I think I wasn't ready to lead without the thing being resolved. I don't know if that was stubbornness or principle. Maybe both. What kept me was the work itself. I was good at it. I knew I was good at it. The clients I worked with knew I was good at it. I could tell from the way my main contact at the Pennsylvania County called me directly now, rather than routing through the official account channels. The way the Transit Authority in Northern Ohio always asked specifically for me to be on their review calls. That trust was mine. Nobody had given it to me or passed it along or forwarded it with their name in the subject line. It was the one thing I had that was completely, unambiguously mine. The thing that changed everything was not something I engineered. It started with a federal compliance audit. Meridian had been awarded a mid-tier federal subcontract through one of our larger accounts. Standard consulting work, nothing unusual. Except that during the audit process, the federal contracting officer requested documentation on our methodology for calculating overhead rates across our municipal clients. This is where it got interesting, because my manager had, over the previous 2 years, presented my work, including my Pennsylvania analysis, in ways that created some inconsistencies in Meridian's official methodology documentation. Not fraudulent, exactly. More like the gap you get when someone summarizes something they don't fully understand and the summary quietly diverges from the original. When the auditors started asking specific questions, my manager answered them in ways that created more inconsistencies. I was not in any of those conversations. I found out through a paralegal I'd become friendly with who mentioned in the kitchen that there was some question about the overhead rate documentation and that the partners were a little stressed. I went home that evening and opened my personal folder. I had everything. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened next, because I think people sometimes tell this part of the story like they planned it, like there was a moment where they thought now and executed something they'd been building toward all along. That's not quite how it was for me. What happened was I got a call. It was from the VP of the government division, not my manager, the person above my manager. She had never called me directly before. We'd been in the same meetings maybe 4 or 5 times. She knew my name and she knew I was on the Pennsylvania account, and that was approximately the extent of it. She called at 8:47 in the morning. I was on my second cup of coffee and still in the parking lot because I'd been listening to a podcast and didn't want to stop in the middle of a segment. She said, "I need to understand Pennsylvania methodology completely. Your manager has been walking us through it, but I'm not getting a full picture, and we have auditors coming in on Thursday." I said, "Okay." She said, "Can you come in early tomorrow?" I said yes. That night I organized my documentation folder, not to present it as a revelation, just to be able to answer questions clearly. The meeting the next morning was me, the VP, and 2 people from the legal team. I walked them through the Pennsylvania analysis from the beginning, my original data sources, my calculation methodology, the 3 versions of the model I'd built before I felt confident in the numbers, the executive summary I'd written with the date in the footer that any competent person could cross-reference against any email timestamp. The lawyers were very quiet for a long time. One of them asked how I stored my working documents. I said I kept personal copies of my significant analyses as a professional habit. He nodded in a way that suggested this was either the best thing I could have said or the worst, and he wasn't sure yet which. The VP asked, toward the end, whether my manager had been involved in building the original model. I thought about that question for exactly as long as it took me to be honest. He asked me for a summary, I said. I gave him the full analysis. I'm not going to tell you that my manager was immediately fired or publicly humiliated or escorted from the building. That's not how these things work, and I think anyone who spent time in a corporate environment knows that accountability at that level moves slowly and quietly, and mostly through channels you're not invited into. What I can tell you is this: the federal audit was resolved. The methodology documentation was corrected. Meridian submitted revised materials that accurately reflected the actual analytical process, which was, in the documented record, mine. 3 weeks after that meeting, my manager went on what was described as an extended leave. He did not return from it. I was promoted to senior analyst and assigned as the primary account lead on the Pennsylvania client, officially, with my name on the contract and my signature on the deliverables. The title came with the salary adjustment that was, I will say, somewhat less than what I thought I deserved, but significantly more than what I'd been receiving. The VP called me into her office to tell me. She said the firm recognized that I'd been carrying more than my share, and that they wanted to make sure that was reflected going forward. I nodded and said thank you. I did not say, it only took 3 years in a federal audit. But I thought it. What I actually did say. Because the VP was someone who seemed genuinely interested in doing things correctly. And because I'd spent enough time being quiet about the wrong things that I wanted to be specific about the right ones, was that I'd appreciate a formal scope of work document for the new role that clearly outlined what accounts I was responsible for and what resources I'd have to do that work. She looked slightly surprised. Then she said, "That's a good idea. I'll have legal draft something." It was a small thing, but it mattered. When you've watched your work float upward without your name attached to it for long enough, you learn that the paper trail isn't bureaucracy. It's the only version of yourself the organization actually sees. The Pennsylvania client sent a note when they heard I'd been promoted. My contact there, a woman I'd been working with for almost 2 years, serious and careful, and the kind of person who remembers what you told her 6 months ago, sent an email to the VP with me CC'd. It said, among other things, that she was relieved the account would continue to be in my hands, and that the county had consistently found my work to be unusually thorough. The VP forwarded it to me with a note that just said, "Well deserved." I printed that email, not because I'm sentimental, because I'd learned, by then, that documentation is just another word for not letting the record be written by someone else. I stayed at Meridian for another 2 years after that, long enough to see the department rebuilt with clearer accountability structures, partly because of what the audit had exposed about how attribution had been handled, long enough to mentor 2 junior analysts, both of whom I made sure got their names on their work from day one, long enough to feel like the ending was actually an ending and not just a pause. When I left, I went to a smaller firm where the work was more complex and the politics were approximately 1/4 as exhausting. I negotiated my salary before I accepted the offer, which I had never done before at Meridian, and which turned out to make a $14,000 difference. I didn't take anything with me that wasn't mine. I didn't need to. People ask me sometimes what the lesson is, whether it's about patience or documentation or speaking up or finding the right moment. I think the honest answer is all of it, in the right order. The documentation wasn't a strategy. It was just paying attention. The patience wasn't passivity. I want to be clear about that because I spent a long time wondering if it was. The moment in the VP's office wasn't planned. It was just that when the question finally arrived, I had the answer. What I know now that I didn't know then is that there is a version of quiet that comes from fear, from not wanting to make trouble, from hoping that being good at your job is enough, and that eventually the right people will notice. And there's a version of quiet that comes from being very clear about what you actually have. I was doing the first one for longer than I should have. Then the audit came, and I walked into that conference room, and I just told the truth in order, with the dates and the footers. My manager had louder arguments for years. I had the original files. The last time I saw him was in the parking lot, about 2 weeks before he went on leave. He was loading a box into his car. The kind of box that appears in offices when someone is asked to consolidate their personal items and it's not their idea. He saw me. I saw him. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The numbers had already done that. I thought a lot about what the word quiet actually means. Not the way it's used in a performance review, lacks executive presence, needs to be more visible, but what it actually is in practice when someone chooses it. Because there are two very different kinds of quiet, and for a long time I was doing the wrong one. The first kind is the quiet of someone who's afraid, who does the work and hopes the right person notices, who sends the 12-page memo and watches it get forwarded under someone else's name and tells herself that being good at the job is enough, that eventually it evens out, that making noise would only make things worse. I lived in that quiet for the better part of 3 years. It felt like patience. It wasn't. It was just fear with better posture. The second kind of quiet is something different. It's what happens when you stop waiting to be seen and start making sure the record is accurate. Not loudly, not dramatically, just carefully. A timestamp here, a CC on an email there, a follow-up note after every client call that said confirming our conversation, but really said I was here, I did this, the date is in the footer. The shift between those two kinds of quiet is the whole story, really. My manager was not a villain in the cinematic sense. He didn't scheme or plot. He just did what people do when accountability is soft and the path of least resistance runs through someone else's work. He took it. Presentation after presentation, bonus after bonus, conference invitation after conference invitation. And I let it happen because I told myself the work mattered more than the credit. That's true, by the way. The work does matter more than the credit. But here's what I got wrong. The record of who did the work, that matters just as much. Not for ego, for accuracy. For the moment when an auditor walks in and asks a specific question and somebody has to answer it correctly, or the whole thing falls apart. When that moment came, my manager didn't have the answer. He'd summarized the work too many times, passed it through too many meetings, and somewhere in all that translation, the actual methodology, the careful, specific, documented thing I had built, got lost. I had it. I'd had it the whole time. That's not luck. That's not karma in any mystical sense. That's just what happened when someone does honest work and keeps honest records. The truth has a way of staying true regardless of who's been speaking over it. You don't have to force it to the surface. You just have to not let it get buried. What I know now, and what I wish someone had told me earlier, is that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when people are watching. It's about doing it so precisely, so thoroughly, that when the moment arrives where it actually counts, you have nothing to reconstruct. You just have to open the folder and tell the truth in order. My manager had louder arguments for 3 years. I had the original files. The audit didn't care about the arguments.